we decided to use military power. Russia is the latest example. And more Europeans are beginning to say, is this really what we want to do? As I said, I think on some program recently, when I was talking to a European, I think they were Swiss, I said, where are all of these anxious Norwegian, Danish, Dutch, German volunteers ready to suit up and march east to the Eastern Front and fight the Russians? I said, if they're out there, I haven't seen them. And I don't see much stomach for it in Europe. And by the way, I'm not advocating that. I think the whole idea is very stupid because I never saw Russia today through the lens that is Soviet. This is not the Soviet Union. This is a very different Russia. And it is also much more limited in its capabilities, as people have pointed out. Now, in the United States, you have a somewhat different picture. The two parties have disappointed Americans for a very long time simply because they have become so much alike. And quite frankly, I'm not sure that we can expect very much to change in the near term. Americans are not different from Europeans in one sense. Until things go very badly in the economy, until it hits them, until they can't heat their homes, until they can't afford to buy gas for their automobiles and trucks, until they themselves can't do business, Americans have a bad habit of being very complacent. And so in the short run, I don't expect a lot to change. But after January, and once we move into the new era, I think we're going to see this Ukraine fatigue begin to set in because we have spent more money right now on Ukraine than Russia spends on its entire national defense budget. And at the same time, we have people here who are in very bad straits. The border is open. Millions of people are pouring into this country from Latin America and other places. We don't know anything about them. Our crime rates in our cities are astronomical. The rule of law has broken down. There's very little faith right now among many, many Americans in the viability of elections. So I think long term, we're going to see profound change, that ultimately the United States will turn inward and walk away from most of these things. And that's a very important point for the Norwegians and Swedes and others to understand. We are not, technically speaking, a continental power anywhere but in the Western Hemisphere. We are otherwise preeminently a maritime and aerospace power. In other words, we're very much like the British Empire. Where was Britain's strength? In its navy and commercial interests and industrial production. That's the United States. We're just a bigger version of the old British model. And so we are not a nation with the staying power to fight major wars on other people's continents. And if you go back to World War II, we thought that was horrific. We had exhausted our manpower base. We took almost, by Soviet standards, almost no casualties. At least 15 million Soviet troops were killed. We think as many as 39 to 40 million people died in the Soviet Union during World War II. We can't begin to deal with those kinds of numbers. And we would have had no chance against the Germans whatsoever had we not had the Soviets in the East. Our strength was naval and air force. That's what it is today. We have a very small army. If we attempt anything on the continent, we're potentially in a lot of trouble. We're not perhaps as bad off as the French army, but we're not very well off. So I think people need to understand that Putin is a man aware of his limitations, his country's limitations. We Americans don't seem to recognize that. We are very limited in what we can do militarily, contrary to what we think about ourselves. And that's a problem. But I think we will be rescued by economic reality here at home after the first of the year. The first of the year. Have taken for granted that the people in Washington they elect to office will represent their interests. They're discovering that both parties are disappointments. If you were to ask an American on the street in Seattle, Washington, or an American on the street in St. Louis, Missouri, about NATO, you have at least a 50% chance he doesn't even know what you're talking about. And if he does, he may not understand what it really means. When you start to talk about Article 5, when NATO as an alliance might use force in response to what another NATO ally experiences, they have no idea what that means. They don't understand the subtleties. So my point is that America, in fact, a good friend who's a Spanish officer, was in the Spanish army and served with me, said it best. He said, Doug, you know, the United States is not another country. It's another planet. Well, I think he's right. And, you know, I spent most of my life very focused on Europe and the Middle East in particular, but most part of Europe, and my focus was always on Germans, Russians, and Poles, to be blunt, in terms of all my political studies and historical work. But that's unusual. Most people know nothing about any of it and can't find anything on a map. Now, part of that is our educational system. But remember, if you live in most of the United States, you don't need to know a great deal about what's going on in the rest of the world to be successful, to make money, let alone get elected to office. If you sat down with most of the people sitting in Congress and asked them any hard questions about matters today in Ukraine or Eastern Europe, some would repeat the nonsense they're getting to the mainstream media. Oh, the Russians are evil, they're bad, and they commit war crimes, and we have to stop them and save this pristine democracy in Ukraine from destruction. You'll get a few, but most people, they won't really know much at all. And so when you ask them, well, how do you vote? Well, now you have to look at their political donors, the people that donate to their campaigns. And that answers your question about why so little seems to change in foreign and defense policy, because the people with a great deal of money that have grown rich are interested in keeping us committed in various places around the world. And the argument is always the same. Oh, if the United States leaves, the world will end. Well, the world was around for 5,000 plus years before we came along, and it's going to be there when we're gone. So I reject the notion that nothing can happen in the world without American participation. But this was the great myth in the 1990s of the indispensable superpower, that without us, nothing can happen. We're bankrupt. We have trillions in debt. Our economy is in ruins. Our infrastructure needs work. Our armed forces are remarkably small, but we have more generals and more admirals than we've ever had in our entire history. So when you ask me, is anything going to change? Short term, no, but long term, absolutely. We can't go on. We can't go on like this. Well, I've forgotten the name of the man, but I think he spoke for one of the scientific organizations in the United States that monitors this sort of thing. And he told people a few weeks ago that there was less than a 10 to 20% chance of nuclear weapons being employed. Now, I don't know how he ended up with that, but that seems to have immediately disappointed everyone in the mainstream media, who promptly stopped talking to the man. We were the ones that began talking here in Washington about the potential for limited nuclear war. And this is something that we've dealt with over the last 50 years again and again. We went through this towards the end of the 60s. It reared its head again in the 80s. It is insane. Anybody with any common sense understands that you cannot build so-called tactical nuclear weapons, smaller yield weapons of, say, 5 kilotons or less, hurl those at the Russians or the Chinese or anybody who has nuclear weapons, and then say, well, they'll understand. That's only a small nuclear weapon. They'll understand it's not a big one. No, what you would get under those circumstances, particularly today with the Russians, if we used a small nuclear weapon, they'd launch a first strike and annihilate us. And we would, in response, launch our strike, and that would annihilate them. We know that. They know that. I think President Biden, although I find him very, very disturbing on many, many levels, I think he understands that that is off the table. Now, his advisors, I think, are equally aware of that, but you never know. But I think they understand that's a non-starter. The Russians have it enshrined in doctrine, effectively says nuclear weapons will be reserved exclusively for the use as retaliatory weapons if at any point in time we are attacked with nuclear weapons. In other words, we will retaliate. We will not go down the path of first use. So I think that's very important. And the Russians do not talk or discuss any longer limited tactical nuclear war. So that's good news. The bad news on our side is that foolish people have now said, no, we will no longer make the same pledge. We reserve the right to use a nuclear weapon under all and any circumstances if things don't go the way we want them to. And that's what's got people worried. I'm sure Moscow's worried. It worries me because given our weakness on the ground in terms of high-end conventional warfare, that if we did stagger into Ukraine and we took heavy casualties and we looked ridiculous, that someone might raise the specter of using a weapon to cover our failure. Remember, I think your countryman, Mr. Stoltenberg, insists that Ukraine's defeat would represent failure for NATO. I have never seen it that way because Ukraine is not a NATO member. But nevertheless, that's Stoltenberg's message, which I think reflects the guidance that he's getting from Washington, because we know he's a mouthpiece for Washington. Personally, no, I don't see any evidence that we'll see nuclear weapons used, but you can, reasons I just outlined. In 1914, Russia was Germany's number one trading partner, and Germany was Russia's number one trading partner. In 1941, Russia was Germany's number one trading partner, or the Soviet Union was, and Germany was the number one trading partner with the Soviet Union. So the notion that if you trade with each other, you won't go to war, obviously, is a false assumption. And as a result, I was never critical of the Germans for simply looking for the cheapest energy they could buy to sustain their scientific industrial base. And that was what it was all about. And the assumption that was made in Washington is, well, if the Germans are importing and 40% of their energy from Russia, that makes them dependent on Russia, and they could then become the slaves of Moscow. Well, that's absurd, because you also have to look at what the Germans are selling to the Russians. And you could make the argument that the Russians are slaves to German technology, engineering, and other capabilities. I think it was a terrible mistake to destroy that line. And I think the Germans will increasingly come to the conclusion that that was an act of war against Germany. And one could certainly argue it was an act of war against Russia. Now, we have never admitted to doing anything. And there is now a great deal of information on the net about the United Kingdom having ultimately been at the center of all of this. I'm not in the government and the administration, and I'm not privileged to those conversations, so I don't know what the answer is. But from my standpoint, if I were a German or a Russian, I would see this as a very hostile act, an act that is antithetical to my national security, my interests, my strategic position. Now, interestingly enough, it appears that the Norwegians are now delivering natural gas to Poland. And the Poles are paying more for Norwegian natural gas than they did for Russian natural gas, which I guess is interesting for the Poles, but they'd much rather pay more and get it from Norway than Russia, I'm sure. I don't know what's going on, but it doesn't look good to me. And my concern from the beginning was NATO would probably not survive this if it lasted for more than 6 months. In fact, the EU may not survive it. There are too many divergent interests, but most important, the thing that we seem to be most interested in Washington is driving a wedge between Germany and Russia. And in doing the things that we have thus far, I think we will achieve the opposite outcome. That before the year is out, we will see a very different relationship emerge between Moscow and Berlin that we probably are not. Well, you know, Norway is one of those countries that if you ask about it in the United States, you will hear people say, oh, I love Norway. Norway is wonderful. Norwegians are wonderful. Everyone feels that way. So Norway enjoys a very positive position with Americans. The issue for Norway is what is the strategic benefit to Norway of cultivating hostility with Russia? When I ask that question, I see no benefit to Norway from a bad strategic relationship with Russia. Now, obviously, the Norwegians have an alliance with the United States. We call it NATO, but on a bilateral level, it's very real. It's there, also with the United Kingdom. But what do we know from history? We know that in 1940, Norway was neutral. Churchill discarded that out of hand, dismissed it out of hand, and said, no, we must race to Norway and beat the Germans to it. If we don't take on Norway, then Norway will end up being occupied by the Germans. And he was joined in this by the president of France. Remember, they put together a force that was supposed to originally march across Norway and Sweden to join the Finns in fighting the Russians, which would then have made Great Britain and France the enemies of both Russia or the Soviet Union and Germany at the same time. But that didn't work out. And so the fallback position was, well, let's go to Norway. I don't think Norway benefited very much from the whole experience. And I don't think that we or the British right now can fast enough if Norway needed it to rescue Norway. Now, that's just my personal observation. I don't think the Russians have any interest in attacking Norway. I don't think the Russians want to isolate Norway. In fact, I don't think they care what Norway does. They would be happy to do business with Norway. But again, I am seeing Russia through a lens that's very different from what we in London and Washington are pushing. We're pushing this false paradigm. The revanchist Soviet leader is leading the new resurrected Soviet Union on a bid to conquer Eastern Europe. See no evidence for it. Nothing could be further from the truth. But if you're sitting in Oslo and you believe that, then it may make sense to you to offer these bases. But I would urge Norwegians to give this careful consideration. There is no substitute for good relations with your neighbor. And it is advisable to cultivate good relations if you can. I don't see any benefit to bad relations, and I don't think they're necessary. But I hold a minority opinion, obviously.